get started with a brief introduction while the last few people trail in. So welcome everyone. So you all know that this is the Departmental Seminar for Language and Linguistics at the University of Essex, which I'm hosting here today. I'll be introducing our speaker, Michael Fiddler. Michael and I had the pleasure of studying together, at least it was a pleasure for me, many years ago at what's now Dallas International University. Between that time, Michael spent a lot of time teaching in China at Zhejiang Normal University, where he also decided to learn some Uyghur and get involved with students there from the Uyghur region studying their language, which he then was able to turn into a PhD project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So today we get to hear pieces of that research project. It's a pretty unique project in that it brings together some disciplines that we tend to keep separate, looking at syntax, looking at information structure, and also prosody, and seeing how all of that comes together. So Michael, thank you for joining. Thank you for taking the time to put together this presentation. We look forward to hearing your talk. And then at the end of the talk, which will be 30 or 40 minutes, we'll have some time for questions and discussion as well. So keep in mind any questions you want to ask Michael at the end. So thanks, Michael. I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Joey. Always a pleasure to reconnect after some time has gone by. And hey, everyone, thanks for joining. Right, so we're here to talk about syntax, information structure, and prosody in Uyghur. Now, those are all sort of big fields, big things. We're not going to talk about everything, so I'll kind of lead us as we go and explain which parts of syntax and what key aspects of information structure and whatnot that we'll be dealing with in this presentation. But I want to start with just a brief introduction to the Uyghur language. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's in the Turkic language family. This map shows the whole language family spread out across Eurasia. Uyghur is in the sort of light blue on the right in the northwest corner of China. And its closest relative is Uzbek, which is a slightly different shade of blue over to the left. Uyghur is also spoken across the border in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and a bit in Uzbekistan, as well as in diaspora communities elsewhere in the world. Roughly 12 to 15 million speakers, give or take. How I ended up getting involved with this, we've all got our own stories as to how we end up with the languages that we work on. This isn't obviously my own home language. But as Joey mentioned, I was teaching at Zhejiang Normal University on the other side of China. Here's the view from across campus. Was a great place to be for a few years. But there were Uyghur students from the Uyghur region that studied at this university. I happened to just get to know some of them and hear their language as they were using it, and caught my ears as a linguist, and ended up hiring a guy to tutor me, and sort of took it from there. My proficiency was sort of chugging along slowly since I wasn't actually living in a community of Uyghur speakers. But when I came back to the States, I had the chance to study in some summer intensive language programs at University of Wisconsin-Madison with these two wonderful teachers, Gonisa Nazarova and Ekber Ahmet, who have gone on to be good friends and colleagues in linguistics over the years. The other bit of background to know, I got to go out and visit the Uyghur region in 2016 in the summer. It was this, super interesting Central Asian culture, architecture, food, markets, and all the things that, I hadn't encountered as much in East China. But it was also very clear that this was an occupied territory. There was military vehicles and personnel on like literally every street corner. And if you followed the news starting from about 2017, shortly after my visit, the Chinese government started a very harsh crackdown campaign on the Uyghurs to really assimilate and erase their cultural identity. There had been conflict in the region for pretty much ever since the Qing dynasty annexed it, and the current government is just sort of done with that. And so there's been millions of people rounded up into detention camps, re-education camps, offered factory jobs in inner China that they cannot refuse. Lots of things, among others, the language itself is being threatened, where these people that have been put in re-education camps are forced to speak Mandarin only, punished for speaking Uyghur. Children by the hundreds of thousands are being put in boarding schools where they're educated only in Mandarin. And so the language itself, in addition to the whole cultural identity, is facing a crisis. And it's anybody's guess as to how things are going to end up, if there's going to be policy shifts in the upcoming years. But from Western colonial history, we know how languages fare after enough time of boarding schools and this kind of tactics. So we're hoping to, along with Uyghur activists, do everything we can to continue ensuring that the language and the culture has space to thrive in the world today. But there are definitely real threats to it at this point. So the documentation and description and maintenance work that people are doing now is very important. The topic for today, syntax, information structure, and prosody. This portion of my dissertation research started out to examine what the syntax-prosody relationship was like in Uyghur. My dissertation overall addressed a number of aspects of prosody, word level and phrase level. But this portion was looking at specifically how syntax and prosody relate to each other. And so I ended up actually digging into some things that I didn't expect to find about constituent order. And so the first part will be talking about that. Syntax here, of course, there's so many different things we could talk about in syntax, but focused on sort of the simple notion at this point of just constituent order, what order the parts of the sentence go in. And it turned out that some of the variation I observed, I think, can be best explained by appealing to information structure. And then secondarily, the next part of the investigation was then, okay, looking at these maybe non-prototypical or non-canonical constituent orders, what prosodic patterns are associated with them. And then that brought me around full circle back to some morphosyntax, morphology, even strictly at the synchronic point, but how this kind of explains a diachronic puzzle that had been bugging me for a little while. So we'll see if we can get into all of these things in the next half hour. If you know about the Turkic language family, you'll probably be expecting this, but the default constituent order for a clause is SOV, subject, object, verb, and any adverbial elements, so adverbs, adverbial phrases, adverbial clauses, and such will come somewhere mixed around the subject and the object, but before the verb. So here's a simple example from a tested conversation. The subject actually wasn't stated, but that's where it would go if it was there. Ular hazırlıkça tehi inak bir uhturuş kalmadı. Subject first, a couple adverbial elements, then an object, and then the verb at the end. Okay, so there's a pretty prototypical Uyghur sentence. Now, I'll get to some of the variation and the other orders, alternate orders in a minute, but now we need to loop into information structure to show sort of where that variation comes from. And this hadn't been investigated much for Uyghur that I was able to find, but it has unsurprisingly been written about fairly extensively for Turkish. Turkish is sort of the flagship language of the Turkic family. It gets the most, has had the most research and attention and linguistic investigation so far. If you imagine English within your Indo-European, Turkish is kind of in a similar position. So there's a really nice book on constituent order variation, basically in Turkish, and how that relates to information structure and other aspects of the language, function of word order. And so the information structure concepts that I'm thinking of here are essentially how freshly activated each item in the sentence is in the discourse context. Is it brand new out of the blue information that the speaker had no context for, or sorry, the addressee, the listener? Is it something that is just mentioned in the last sentence, so it's very fresh in the mind, it's given information? Is it somewhere in between, so is it accessible based on the things that have been mentioned, or just general world knowledge and things like that? And we can also think about notions like topic and focus or comment and things like that. Topic being the thing that the sentence is about. It's typically a given item that's been mentioned already in the conversation or in the context. The focus is typically the new element or the emphasized, most salient element. And so this is what Erguvanli wrote up for Turkish. And the more I looked into Uyghur, it seems like the basic template is pretty similar. Topics will go first. Other material can be sort of mixed around in there that's not topical and not focal. The focal point is typically right before the verb. And then if there's anything else that doesn't fit into one of those slots, it can be after the verb as backgrounded information. So going back to our prototypical Uyghur sentence, these information structure categories typically map according to the following syntactic elements where the topic is typically a subject. Other material may include different adverbials or things like that, time, place, manner, etc. The focus is often the object, and then the verb is the verb, of course. But this sentence doesn't have any backgrounded information after the verb. But that was this thing that actually jumped out to me as I was going through the data that I had for my dissertation is all these elements are coming up as background information after the verb. Like, what are they doing there? What kind of elements are they? How and when can this happen? Why doesn't anybody talk about this in Uyghur language learning textbooks or other linguistic work? And so that was what I was really drawn to working through this data. And so that's what we'll spend a lot of our time talking about today. Here's an example of a sentence with some backgrounded elements. Two major main clauses, and each of them has some background elements. The first one has a adverbial clause, when I cook, which comes after the main verb, alaman. The second one has an object and an adverb at the end of the sentence. So I'll actually play a clip of this one, and you can hear what it sounds like from the speaker who produced this.
Şimdi huzur olma tamak etsem, lekin her gün etmeyeme tamak nazır.
One more time just to get a little bit of Uyghur in your ears.
Şimdi huzur olma tamak etsem, lekin her gün etmeyeme tamak nazır.
Okay. Oops, there we go. Okay, so this recording comes from the data that I pulled together for the dissertation and just as a resource. I was interested in looking at speech as used in like actual conversation, not only in maybe speeches or in written text and such. And I didn't find any resource like that. And I know that's an important aspect of documenting your language is having recordings that are well annotated of just daily interaction and things like that. So I initiated this corpus of conversational Uyghur project. It's online now at www.uyghurcorpus.org. It's a fairly small corpus at this point. We had 4 solid conversations, each with 2 participants, about an hour and a half of audio. I've got a few more conversations waiting that have been, initial transcription done, but needs the rest of the annotation. I'll get there someday. But you can take, this isn't going to pull up probably. If you've got time later, you can take a look at that. I've got to get back to my window. How do I do that? Shoot. There we are. Okay. But this is where most of these examples that I'm showing you today, certainly all the ones with audio, come from this corpus. So this post-predicate or post-verbal background and position was what I was interested in. I did a little study from the conversation corpus, trying to investigate how this stuff works. What I ended up doing is going through and just tagging all the subjects, objects, dative, and adverbials in the whole corpus, tagging them for whether they're in their expected position before the verb or in this post-predicate backgrounded position. And so that allowed me to get kind of an overall quantitative view of how frequent this position is used, but then also gave me a whole bunch of really interesting examples to look at. So I'm going to show you the examples first, and then we'll quantify sort of how it all shook out in the numbers, and we'll move on to looking at the prosody. give you some more examples here. And this is the fun part, for me, just showing all the data and what's attested. And so whatever you all think of my, analysis and conclusions at the end here, I think, at the very least, this will give you a good look at some of the structures that are used in Uyghur, and what this cool language has going on in it. And I think if I give you a taste of that at the very least, that'll be a successful accomplishment for the talk here. So I mentioned the background is subject slot after the verb. Turns out you can also topicalize things that might go in another position in an unmarked sentence. So here the object is in the topic slot at the beginning of the sentence. The subject comes next, and then the verb. I didn't know that. That is the sort of, here he's talking about the fact that he thought turnips were only found in the Uyghur region, but then he came to America and didn't even think to look for them, and then suddenly saw them at the grocery store. It's like, they have turnips here too, and there's like lots of different kinds of them. It's great. I didn't know that before. So the that, or this, that he's referring to is the thing that's been carried on from the previous discourse context. And so that's what goes as the topic slot, and then the subject can come after that. Here's the clip of the audio you can listen to. Okay, so the topic comes first, and then the other elements. Here's an explicitly topicalized item with this this verb to say. They're the same conversation. They're talking about quinoa, and the speaker's like, "What is this thing called quinoa that you mentioned?" This is leftist location, where the topic is set off separately from the rest of the sentence syntactically, and then it corresponds with the subject, this, here in bu. So that thing you called quinoa, what is it? Is it a rice type grain? So here now moving to the postposed background slot items. Here's an object that came up in that slot. This is from a conversation between a mom and her 8-year-old kid. There's a little, 1 or 2-year-old in the background. Also, something happens between the two kids, and the mom says, "What are you doing, knocking your little brother over?" But the what are you doing comes first, and then like, why are you knocking him over? And then your little brother comes after the verb in that backgrounded slot. You can listen to this one.
It's not my fault I tripped.
Typical 8-year-old response there. The object goes after the verb here, not in its typical slot right before the verb. And I could point out, most of my data, again, is from conversational Uyghur, and this backgrounded slot definitely is used more often in spoken Uyghur than in written Uyghur. But you will see it from time to time in writing as well. Here's a sentence from one of the most famous novels in 20th century Uyghur literature, called Trace or Traces, written by eminent literary figure Abdurrahim Utkur. In this sentence, you've got the quoted speech functioning as the object of the speech verb, and then the subject of the speech verb comes after there, and an adverbial clause, smiling, comes at the very end. And this is actually fairly unusual to get these converb clauses coming after the verb. Converbs, if you're not familiar, are sort of a special non-finite verb construction or clause type in Turkic languages. I think Mongolic languages, some others have them as well. But these are most of the time found before the main verb. In this case, it comes at the end, after the speech verb. So this one doesn't have audio. I think that's a mistake here, but I'll read it for you. Mihman başlap keldim dedi aman kul külüm sürep. So the subject comes after the speech verb, and then the adverbial clause comes even after that. And this is worth noting also, you can have more than one element in this post-verbal slot. It's not limited to only one constituent there. Here's another postposed converb clause. Again, these are pretty rare. This is actually one of my favorite sentences in the whole corpus. Again, from that the bit with the mom working with her 8-year-old. The context here, this is during the COVID era from like 2021, asking her son if he wants to choose, going to school in person or if they're going to be in the group that starts out on Zoom for the next year. And the kid says he wants to go to campus. The mom says, "Why? Like, what are you gonna? What makes you decide that?" And he said, "No reason. I don't care. I just want to." And then so she speculates with this sort of tongue-in-cheek comeback. Tired of the computer, huh? You've been playing too many video games? But the way she phrases it in Uyghur, the from playing too many video games is a postposed converb clause. Çık oyna verip. But then within that postposed clause, you also have the object appearing after the converb, which is like both of these things are very rare, having an object that goes after the converb. Objects after finite verbs are pretty common, but having this separated out this is just a really special sentence. So I'll play it for you here.
Kompüterimiz zerikten bulalım ya. Çık oyna verip video game'ni ya.
And the kids giggle there. Makes you think that the mom might have something with this speculation here. The other fun thing, we're not into prosody yet, but that the way she pronounced the oyna virip, that vir suffix after the verb root there, that indicates sort of free and unrestrained action, or maybe succeeding in doing the action despite some kind of obstacle. And that one often has this big sort of exaggerated pitch rise right on that suffix or on the vowel right before it at the end of the verb root. I'll play it again for you so you can catch that.
Kompüterimiz zerikten bulalım ya. Çık oyna verip video game'ni ya.
And she's teasing him obviously, so there's extra reason to exaggerate the intonation. But in many other contexts also, whether it's emphatic or whatever, that particular verb suffix often has a real distinct intonation contour with it. So there's lots of cool things going on in this sentence with the syntactic order, the prosody as well, and the discourse function of sort of poking fun or teasing the kid. So I've shown you a handful of different things that can appear in this post-predicate position. Here's sort of a quantitative table summing this up. Nothing super complex about this analysis, just simple proportions out of one. But I divided it up, as I said, into subjects, objects, datives, and adverbials, and then further binned those into constituent size categories. So looking at just simple pronouns, then one-word lexical constituents and multi-word lexical constituents. And there's a lot of numbers here, so I'll highlight ones that stood out to me. One is that the pronouns overall appeared on average a bit more often in the post-predicate slot, and at a rate that's not insignificant. It's not a huge percentage proportion, but well over 10% of all pronouns in these four categories are occurring after the predicate, whether they're subjects, objects, datives, or adverbial pronouns, like in this way, like a demonstrative pronoun used adverbially. One-word lexical items a little bit less, and multi-word lexical items even less. But the other category that jumped out is the adverbials. Of the different argument types, those are the ones that appeared most often after the predicate. Just under 10% for multi-word longer adverbial phrases or clauses, over 20% for one-word lexical adverbs or adverbial items. So one in 5 of those in this whole corpus appeared after the predicate. And so those are the two things that jumped out at me, the pronouns being used pretty frequently, pretty consistently at a certain rate in this post-predicate position, and then the adverbial type arguments being also pretty frequent there. So this shows me that this is not just like a once in a blue moon kind of construction that comes up very marginally. This is pretty consistent. A lot of sentences, a lot of utterances in this corpus put items in this backgrounded post-predicate slot. Okay, so there's kind of a sketch of the constituent order phenomena. Now I wanted to share about the prosody investigation I did here. Some of the work was just kind of looking at how prosodic breaks in general correspond to syntactic breaks. I won't show you a lot of data there, but just, the general finding was that, yeah, typically you're going to take a prosodic break, pause for breath or something like that, reset your intonation contour, when you've got to a stopping point in the syntax. That makes sense. You've got the usual suspects for when that doesn't happen. Somebody runs out of air and wants to take a breath in the middle of the clause. That happens. You pause to sort of figure out what the next thing is you're going to say. That's a reason to break in the middle of a syntactic unit. Maybe if you made a mistake and wanted to go back and reformulate what you just said. Or occasionally there's, rush throughs where there is a major syntactic break, a new sentence starts, but the speaker just plows right on ahead without resetting the intonation. That happens from time to time too, but typically your prosodic breaks do correspond to syntactic breaks. But then looking at these post-predicate items, I looked into 3 prosodic properties. One being whether there's any like pause or break between, the rest of the sentence and that post-pose item. 2, whether it's produced at a faster or slower rate of speech, as measured by just syllables per second, relative to the rest of the intonation unit. And then what the pitch contour is doing on that last part of the sentence. And what I found was every once in a while you'll get a real pause. I think I'll show you one example of that. But most of the time there's really no break between the verb or the other predicate and that postposed backgrounded item. And what that tells me is that these aren't just like afterthoughts. Like I finished the sentence and I'm like, oh yeah, forgot to add this part in. Half second later that comes to me, and so I'll add that in afterwards. This is just part of the flow of the sentence. It's intended to be in that position, but just it's put there to be backgrounded because it doesn't need to be in one of those other major slots of topic or focus or some of the other ones up there. The speed, these are not slowed down. Again, like if you're sort of thinking of this as an afterthought, you might expect it to be a little bit slower, more hesitant. But it's normal feed, if not slightly faster. And this was relativized to the rest of the intonation unit, and I picked a comparison group of, the last word or the last like 3-syllable window of other sentences that didn't have a backgrounded item, but just ended with the verb or other predicate. And the speed is very comparable, maybe even a touch bit faster. The intonation contour was almost always falling or low at the end of the sentence when there's a backgrounded item. And that's not entirely unexpected. Intonation often falls at the end of a sentence, but in discourse context, it's also pretty common to have rising intonation to signal that, you're planning to continue, your turn's not over, some types of questions and then rising intonation as well. So it's, maybe about half and half in general, falling versus rising intonation. But sentences with a backgrounded item after the verb are almost always going to end with a falling pitch. So I'll show you another couple examples with the audio, and I've got pitch tracks here and sort of a real-time layout of the sentence so you can see these prosodic aspects. Here's one of the few items where there was actually a break, and this does seem to be more of an afterthought kind of situation where the speaker, pauses for half a second and then throws in this adverbial clause at the end. Oh yeah, when I have the time. So I'll play this one for you and you can hear what it sounds like.
Ken çınıkşını yaxşı görməm, da köçüp çıkıp mağıma vaxtım bolsa.
Okay. So I guess I should maybe sketch out what the usual expected intonation contour is in Uyghur. This is not from my work, but some other colleagues have been investigating this the last few years. The typical pattern is, you get a low to high rise across each major prosodic constituent, so each major content word, or sometimes a small tight group of words that get phrased together. The pitch typically rises at the end of that little group, and then rises, and overall just kind of generally drifts down across the utterance until you get to a break where you reset the contour. So you see that here, Chinakishni, there's a nice rise at the end of that. Mundak, there's a bit of a rise there. Mangaman has a rise in the middle and then a fall at the end, because that was going to be the end of the sentence until the speaker decided to add this last Waktambol Sa, when I've got the time, at the end. But on that last part, it's definitely a falling contour as well. Here's another one. We saw this sentence earlier. This is more typical, where the backgrounded items are joined very closely to the clause that they follow. And we'll take a look at the pitch contour of this one also, because this is a pretty typical instance of how the pitch intonation goes. But I'll play it for you first so you can hear it from the speaker.
Şunda huzur olma tamak etsem, lekin her gün etmeyeme tamak nazır.
Okay, so tamak atsam in the first major group is the post-pose adverbial clause, when I cook, when I make food. In the second one, you've got tamakni, the object, and then hazir, an adverb. Both of these end with clearly falling intonation. But the interesting thing about this was pretty typical. I don't know, a third to half of the post-pose items, I think, had this type of pitch contour where you get a nice little rise at the end of the predicate, the verb here, and then it's after that the pitch drops off. So I'll play it for you one more time, but I'll point out huzur alaman, there's a rise at the end of alaman, and then it drops off for the post-pose item. And then in the second clause, etmayman, another rise at the end of that verb, and then falling off for the backgrounded items. Let's listen to it one more time.
Şunda huzur olma tamak etsem, lekin her gün etmeyeme tamak nazır.
Yep, so this is pretty typical.
Şunda
And so then, how do we put this all together? Why is it coming out this way? What do all these prosodic aspects point to? And I think the best way to take it, again, comes back to the information structure, where what I think is happening is that you've got focus not on the preverbal item in these cases, but maybe on the whole predicate. And focus, people often talk about individual words or individual items that are emphasized or particular salient. But Lambrecht expands that and says we can have different scopes of focus. Broad focus, the whole sentence is kind of just all new information. So, either everything is focused or nothing is focused. However you want to say that. You can have individual items in focus, but you can have sort of medium-sized things like the predicate. And I think that may be what's going on here. And then the thing that goes afterwards, I think there's this notion that Wally Chafe coined quite a while ago, the idea of an anti-topic. And topics we all know about, they're the thing that the sentence is about. They're typically at the start of the sentence in a lot of different languages. Anti-topic is still what the utterance is about, still, kind of a continuing discourse entity usually. But here it's thrown at the end of the utterance, at the end of the clause, rather than in the usual topic position. So I think these are the best terms to describe what's going on here. And it fits in nicely, the prosody, at least, with what Major and Meyer have found for this model of Uyghur intonation. I described the general pattern to you from their work a minute ago, but they looked also at focused items that are emphasized for one reason or another. And typically what you get is an expanded pitch peak at the right edge of that constituent. It may even break out of the declination overall across the utterance. Sometimes you'll get the de-accenting of the following material, where there's not so much of the typical rising and falling of whatever comes after the focus item. And then sometimes there's a focused particle. And so looking back at this one, we could say, I take such pleasure in it is the focused predicate. This subject isn't stated overtly, it's just marked on the verb. And then, so there's a good rise at the end of that. It's not the highest thing in the sentence. But then Tamakatsam is that de-accented following material after the focused portion. Herkunet man, this one, the verb does have the highest pitch peak in that whole clause, breaking out from what you would usually expect of it being slightly lower as a later element. But then again, that postposed material gets de-accented. There's no pitch rise at the end really of tamakni. It just kind of all falls off after that. Here's one more example. This guy was surprised that he found kumul dates from the Uyghur region right here in America at a store called H Mart. That's the Asia market we have over here. So the first bunch of the sentences all kind of leading up to this focus. I found it. H Mart diyen dükkandan taptım.
H Mart diyen dükkandan taptım mı hemen?
So the real big pitch rise on taptım. And then the de-accented material afterwards, the object buni, and the subject man.
H Mart.
So to sum up that stuff, we've learned that constituent order is not strictly SOV. In Uyghur, backgrounded elements will appear after the predicate, often, I think, in this predicate focus plus anti-topic situation. And the post-predicate items are joined smoothly to the rest of the sentence, typically with following intonation. And the last thing I want to leave you with here is, as I mentioned before, this diachronic puzzle that had been bugging me for a while, which I think this gives a nice solution. Oops, shoot, now I've just given away. Go back. There you go. So we've seen a couple of places here. If you had a chance to look at the glossing, most verb categories in Uyghur have the subjects indexed on them with suffixes. There's two different sets of subject marking suffixes, but the one is very clearly derived from personal pronouns, at least for first and second person. You can see here's the verb paradigm. The suffixes are man for first person singular, senses for second person singular, formal and informal, du for third person, mis for first person plural, salaire for second person plural. The personal pronouns, look at this, man, san, sis, biz, and salaire. So this is very obviously, what happened was there was a verb form that didn't have agreement marking historically. There was a pronoun that corresponded to the subject that came after the verb. And the pronoun eventually became acclitic and then reanalyzed as a subject marking suffix. And there's textual evidence from this historically. This is clearly what happened. But if that's the case, and the basic order in Uyghur is SOV, what were those subject pronouns even doing at the end of the clause? Like, why were they there? And as you can probably guess at this point from all the material we've gone through already, I think the best explanation of this is that they're anti-topics. And if you look back at the Erdal's grammar of Old Turkic, this is actually what was going on already, 1,000 years ago, in the oldest attested version of the language family. First person and second person pronouns, unless they're really being emphasized or focused, typically appear after the verb as anti-topics. And so that explains how we got the verb morphology that indexes the subject in these more recent verb paradigms in the modern Uyghur. And you can see even in the modern language, there's still this tendency to put first and second person subject pronouns in that background of the slot, unless there's some special reason to put them at the beginning. Even when verb forms have a subject marking suffix that is exactly identical to that pronoun. So tamakatishnimu yakshi kuraman man. So you've got that doubled up man at the end indexing first person singular. This is still very a robust tendency to put the anti-topic pronoun at the end, even though the historical anti-topic pronoun has become a verb suffix and is already there on the verb. That tendency in the discourse persists in the modern language. So that answered my question. How do we get subject pronouns that became suffixes if our basic word order is SOV? Pronouns do something different, and that happens. So to wrap up here, what does this tell us about Uyghur? As we've said already, the post-predicate position is a robust slot for anti-topics and other backgrounded items. This happens in other languages as well. Turkish, Susan Herring has this nice piece on Tamil doing a very similar thing. And this facilitated the diachronic change of anti-topic pronouns turning into subject suffixes on verb forms. And this has been described before. Bernard Comrie has a piece writing about Buryat, Mongolian, where basically the very same thing happened there. So this is a nice piece about what's happened in Uyghur, some more descriptive understanding of this language. And I think we can generalize from this also some observations about how languages work in outside of just Uyghur. This shows us again, these aren't new points necessarily. You may be all familiar with some of these principles, but how information structure and syntax kind of feed each other back and forth. We might imagine that the subject categories, grammaticalize historically out of a topic like information structure notion. But now that, those are not completely identical, you can still have information structure concerns, shuffling the syntax around, changing the constituent order according to the needs of the information structure. And so those sort of go in a circular relationship over time. We saw how prosody, these marked syntactic constructions may have particular prosodic properties where prosody can be used to signal that there's, this is an alternate order. This isn't the basic default order. So we have some unique prosodic features going on there. And then the last piece, we saw how syntax turns into morphology over time. This is well studied in many languages around the world. There's that classic axiom from Tommy Gavan that today's morphology is yesterday's syntax. One of my favorite classic quotes there. But this also showed us how prosody probably helped facilitate that change. The de-accenting of those anti-topic pronouns, producing them sort of with falling intonation, maybe a bit quicker, that helped facilitate the fusion onto the verb and reanalysis as a suffix. And the last piece is methodologically. Not everybody studies information structure or syntax or prosody using sort of unconstrained naturalistic discourse data. A lot of folks will choose to constrain the stimuli and elicit experimental production of things to study any of these topics. But I was happy that I ended up choosing just conversational data. I think this gave me insight into the range of structures that are in use in Uyghur and their frequency that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to infer if I had sat people down and asked them to produce sentences. They may not have even used these post-predicate structures if they were thinking a bit more consciously and trying to produce maybe more standard grammatical sentences. But taking natural discourse showed me what's actually going on. And this is going to feed into a reference grammar that I'm working on with a co-author here. And then, of course, prosodically, you're going to get, if I ask somebody to sit down and read a sentence with this structure, the prosody might come out a little bit awkward, again, because this happens more in conversation than in written Uyghur. But taking the data straight from natural-ish conversations ensured that the prosody was natural and that I was getting pretty authentic contours and other properties to look into. So I think this worked out well, picking this kind of data for this study. And I'll leave it off there. I think that's about the time we have. And we'll look forward to Q&A for a few minutes here.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Great. Nice to see all that data as well. Definitely challenging to deal with conversation off the bat, but so I can see why not everyone wants to jump into it, but also very rich data and interesting variation to look at. Yeah, still time for discussion. If you want to ask your own question, you can just raise your hand and I will give you the power to ask your own question. But you can also write questions into either into the Q&A or into the chat, and I can read those out for you. Why don't we just jump to Catherine? If you're ready to ask a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much, Michael. That was really interesting. I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on some of the challenges of collecting naturalistic data, perhaps in terms of, ensuring that you were getting the tokens of language that you were looking for, and also as a non-native speaker of Uyghur.
Yeah, that's a great question. And on top of the challenges that you hinted at there, this whole thing started out in the middle of COVID in like early 2021. So I wasn't even allowed by my IRB here, my research body, research board, to go and meet with people in person. So that just compounded the difficulty of even collecting this data to start with. What I ended up doing is getting in touch with people over WhatsApp. Some here in California, some on the East Coast of the US, and I think one of the conversations actually came over from Europe. I just asked people to like take your take your iPhone or whatever smartphone you've got, pull up a recording app and just hit record and sit down and have a conversation. Or like if you're sitting with your family after dinner, if you've got your kid home after school, if you're going on a walk with your friends. One conversation actually came over Zoom. It was two professors who work at different universities here in the States. And they set up a Zoom call and recorded the meeting, just, caught up for half an hour. And so there's some elements of the conversation which I can tell, the people were, really conscious of the fact that they were doing this to contribute to a research project, and, maybe doing a little more of, maybe not the questions that they would have asked each other if it was totally unscripted. Hey, what do you like to do in your free time, or stuff like that, friends wouldn't necessarily be asking each other normally. But I think the way that the conversation played out, listening to the audio, it sounded very natural, as far as the interaction back and forth and the style of production and the pause fillers that were used, and the intonation that I was hearing. Like, this sounded like pretty authentic conversation. Working with this as a non-native speaker was definitely a challenge, especially at that point. I hadn't had the second summer of intensive language course, so my level was very much intermediate still. What I ended up doing is asking a native speaker friend of mine to transcribe each conversation for me. Hired him to do that as part of the research project. And so I got a nearly spot on initial transcription. I ended up making a few tweaks here and there to some things that I think weren't written exactly as they were spoken, but he did a very good job of writing everything out for me, which then gave me the opportunity to, okay, here's the words. Now I can look them up if I don't know them. I can ask somebody about the constructions if I'm not familiar about them. And I went through then and translated all the conversations to English, tagged all the morphology and such, and eventually was able to get a pretty good handle on what was going on. Still a couple of places where what exactly were they saying there? But most of it at this point, I feel pretty comfortable with, after working with it for a couple of years. In terms of the researching the prosody out of naturalistic data, that's also got its own set of challenges, which we can get into if there aren't more questions. But I think I'll stop there for.
Were you doing time-of-line transcription in Elon? Did you have to have like overlapping tiers or how did you do your transcriptions?
That's a good question. Yeah, I started in Elon, segmented into sort of roughly intonation unit size chunks, and then copied and pasted. My friend had just transcribed it in MS Word, so I was going through and just copying and pasting each little chunk in, and then for the phonetic analysis, I exported the transcript to Prot into a text grid, and that saved a bit of time. But then I also had to hand annotate a bunch of things in the Prot tiers. For the morphology, the parsing, I actually set up a lexicon in Elon and did sort of a semi-automated supervised parsing using that, which I think was a worthwhile exercise, especially if I'm going to scale this up and keep adding more conversations. That saves a bit of time.
Thanks, Catherine, for the question. We also had a question in writing from colleague Charles Redmond, who's our resident phonetician, but has also worked in processing, which I think comes through in his question. So he asked probably a strange question from a non-syntactician, but is there any relationship between the use of anti-topic structure and things like sentence length or complexity?
Ooh, that's a fun question. I don't know about overall sentence length. That'll be really interesting to look into. The part I did take a look at, which I think you probably saw earlier, was the length of the postposed constituent itself, where the pronouns pop up more often in that slot versus the multi-word phrases or clauses are backgrounded a bit less frequently. But the overall length of the sentence or the length of the main clause, I haven't looked into. That would be really interesting.
It could be another factor. I mean, that also made me think of your slides about the differences between pronouns and others. I think it's just slides 17 and 18. There's a bit of a puzzle there that's still not clear to me, which was that this seems to happen more often with adverbials when we're talking about lexical phrases. That effect disappears when we're talking about pronouns. So why is the adverbial effect only relevant to lexical phrases and it disappears when you're talking about pronouns?
That is interesting. I actually threw this into a regression model, and the interaction, if I remember right, was not significant. I think maybe both that and maybe my best guess at answering that question is that the adverbial pronouns are pretty infrequent. You can see the count here on the right column is there's only those in the whole corpus. That again, that's not the personal pronouns are pretty rare. Maybe you'd have a locative like at me or like in my possession, but those are going to be more the demonstrative pronouns, in this way or like this or something like that, which maybe just don't come up as much in general. And so, if you've got only 20 tokens here, if one more had gone the other way, then you would have had an imbalance that might have pushed it over to making it more like the other.
So maybe a larger corpus would show the effect for adverbials, but we just don't have enough.
It's possible, yeah. Or yeah, I guess it's possible that adverbial pronouns are kind of a weird thing that might not behave like other types of adverbials.
Also, a pronominally related question. So if I understood correctly, there's this relationship between the post predicate phrases and focus on the predicate. Do you also, what happens with interrogative pronouns, assuming that we're saying that those are inherently focused? Would they normally occur next to the predicate? And can you get both a interrogative pronoun, which is presumably focused, and this post predicate phrase, which is presumably showing that there's focus on the predicate? Does that give you two intonation peaks? How does all that play out?
Yeah, that's good. I didn't look into sort of multiple layers of focus like that. That would be super cool to get into eventually.
I guess it doesn't necessarily happen in the conversations that you were looking at.
Yeah, and I was at this point kind of working with just what was attested in these conversations, and I think interrogative pronouns didn't come up a ton in general. So I mean, there wasn't a ton of questions like, who exactly did this or whatever, or where did she go? I can think of one example off the top of my head, which I could have thrown in here but didn't. The sentence was, "Where is she working now, your daughter?" And it's "Unada ishle du kızınız hazır," where nada is the interrogative for where, ishle du is the verb. So where is she working? And then your daughter goes after the verb, and the adverb now goes at the very end. So you can have interrogatives coupled with backgrounded items after the verb. Would I say that the entire predicate there is focused versus the interrogative pronoun itself? I'd have to think more about what I want to do with that. That's an interesting question.
Well, we got two more questions about your data and how all of that worked. First, a question about the speakers you worked with, asking whether they're heritage speakers of Uyghurs, children of those who immigrated previously, who live outside. Are the people who are in your data, presumably they're in the US, what's their sort of status? Did they grow up in the community? Are they heritage speakers? And would you assume that there'd be differences in how all of this plays out based on whether someone's more of a heritage speaker or has grown up and lived longer inside the indigenous community where they are in their own territory?
Great question. Okay. Of the adult speakers, 7 of the 8 speakers that we heard from were adults. I think all of them were born and raised in the Uyghur region of China or in Central Asia, in a Uyghur-speaking family. The 8-year-old boy was, I think, born, but definitely raised here in California, I think it was. So you heard him reply once in English. He does a bit more code switching in his speech. Still using Uyghur pretty fluently, but definitely also a fluent speaker of American English. Of the adults, some of them have lived here in the States for quite some time. Others are pretty recent. One of the speakers, I think, was less than a year in Virginia. I'm not sure if he lived elsewhere before that. A couple of them have been here for 10 to 20 years, but those two were professors who teach Uyghur language and work in that context on a daily basis. It's not like their entire life has gone to English now. It would be interesting. Like I would love to have had the chance, if not for all the governmental oppression that's going on in the Uyghur region right now, to be able to have gone back there and done recording with speakers there. And I don't, from what I remember of the time when I was in China listening to Uyghur speakers, a lot of the patterns here sound pretty familiar. That was a while back though. Eventually, someday at least, we could probably get into Uyghur communities in Turkey or in Kazakhstan or something like that. It'll be really interesting to build this corpus more with speakers from different regions and see if there's any differences. I imagine there'll be some kind of differences in prosody and lexical use and things like that, of course, but I can't say exactly what those may be.
Final question then also about corpus from Charlie Redmond again. Question for your corpus building. Are there any other naturalistic sources of data on Uyghur, like podcasts, YouTube channels, recorded conferences that could be interesting sources of data?
Yeah, that's a good question. This was designed to be just conversational as much as possible, but yeah, we could find there's stuff on YouTube. There are news programs that people have put out up until the amazing US government budget cuts in the last year. There was a Radio Free Asia regular broadcast going out in Uyghur that was producing articles that were read in Uyghur for news. There's a variety of things. There's somebody in Norway, I think, or Sweden who reads entire novels in Uyghur and posts them to YouTube. So before I was able to get this conversation data, I was planning to work with some of that. Didn't end up cycling back to it yet, but so yeah, eventually someday it'd be cool to look at different genres of speech, news reading, novel reading, TV programs, things like that, or podcasts. It's out there. It just needs time to get into it.
Well, our hour is up, so we should end there and let continue with their days. But thank you everyone for joining us and also for your questions and comments. And especially thank you, Michael, for putting this presentation together. Looking forward to seeing where this research continues to grow as you sort of keep digging into the data and questions about language use.
Yeah. Thanks so much for organizing, Joey. This was fun.